Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have affordable ACT and CLT courses that include everything you need to ace your exam. A full textbook, tons of review questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built in study planner, and full length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Ed Antoine from Antoine Education. And Ed, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Antoine, and I've been running a test prep and tutoring company in Brooklyn, New York for the past 20 years. We do a lot of individual tutoring for SAT prep and also offer courses for the SHSAT, a high school admissions exam.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, so today we're going to be talking, does your kid need executive functioning training or do they just need study skills? So how do you want to start this off? I mean, I'm excited to kind of get into this.
Well, yeah, I think maybe just by trying to answer that question, and almost as if you're in conversation with a parent, because I do feel like people are talking a lot about executive function skills. And I've done, a little formal education in executive function skills through some coursework. And my feeling is that for the vast majority of students, they don't really actually know how to study. They don't really know the mechanics of
Hmm.
like how to study, and I can go into more detail about that as we continue talking. Um, but what their parents are seeing is they're just like they're very disorganized or they're not getting the results that they expect. And they're very bright, but they're not getting the grades that they want or the test scores that they want. And an executive function skills seems like it's being promoted by from a lot of voices saying, hey, that may be the issue. Maybe you need executive function skills coaching. And from my point of view, from what I've learned about over the past couple of years, is that, there are some students who really need it's therapeutic. They actually need
Hmm.
help with their executive functions. There is some issue related to their executive functions. But for most students, they just don't really, they've never in any structured manner been talked about, you know, what does it take to learn something new? How much effort is
Hmm.
required? What are the actions they should take? You know, how should they organize their work? What are the tools that they should use to organize their work? And those I typically I call study skills. Other people call them study skills.
Hmm.
And there's this kind of like overlap between the two.
Yeah, and I think that also like I think one of them is very, I don't know, broad is the word that I'm coming up with right now, but it's kind of like almost like philosophical versus like study skills are very tactical and concrete. And so that's kind of what I'm, you know, thinking about is I just feel like really there's so much that you can do right away with study skills training versus like executive function training is more kind of fuzzy. I don't know. Would you agree with that statement? And
Well, I would say that for the people who, the professionals who work with study skills, it's very precise. They know exactly what they're talking about, and
Mhm,
they're talking about a couple of really, essential skills, like things like emotional regulation, processing speed. They're talking about very specific things, which I would say in the public conversation, when you mostly hear people talking about study, they're not always talking about those things. Often they're talking
mhm,
about what I've heard sometimes people refer to as higher level executive function skills. They're talking about does the student maintain a calendar? Do they plan
mhm,
their work ahead? And sure, those are executive
mhm,
function skills, but they're not like these. You could talk about lower level executive function skills and higher level executive function skills. And I think it's those higher level executive function skills that kind of overlap with basic study skills that a neurotypical student, to use that term, basically a bright kid who doesn't have anything that needs to be addressed therapeutically, but may have never learned like about the process of learning. They don't really understand how the process
mhm,
of learning works. Um, they don't pay a lot of attention to their own habits, how they go about their work, what they do when they get home,
mhm.
how they organize their papers, things like that. So there's nothing really, in their way of them doing better academically, except that they just don't really know what to do. And
Hmm.
no one, and people don't typically talk to them about it in very specific and
Hmm.
precise terms about this is what you should be doing.
Yeah, well, and I think it's like, I don't know how to say this. Like, it's almost like life skills, I guess.
Well, yes, it is life skills. It's definitely life
Yeah.
skills. But yeah, you well, that's kind of why I'm so interested in doing more of it, because I feel like when you help kids learn this kind of things, you're helping them toward a better life. You really are. You're
Hmm.
you're giving them tools that they can use to do better in school, you know, when they need to go look for, to prepare for the profession, when they need to go look for work, if they decide they want to
Hmm.
start a business. These are things that are really helpful. They help you get better grades, better test scores, but they help you out much beyond that as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I wanted to maybe start kind of pinging you with questions. The
Okay, sounds
first
good.
one is, yeah, just like thinking about, you talked about, oh, like, someone's not getting good grades, even though they seem very bright. How can you tell that that's an executive functioning issue versus like maybe they're just not that into it, or maybe like like I personally have met a lot of people that are very bright, but it for whatever reason that didn't necessarily translate to school super well, right?
Right,
So
right.
is that just them? Is that an executive functioning skill, and kind of how can you identify that that is the major issue?
Well, I think that's the thing is that, you can't, I mean, you can figure it out more or less in conversation over the course of, a few weeks, because when you think about things like, emotional regulation, like once
Hmm.
someone knows what they need to do, how hard is it actually for them to do it, in the sense of like, do they get frustrated quickly? Are they unable
Hmm.
to sit through, they're not patient enough, in an
Hmm.
unusual way, not like, obviously everyone has issues with patience, but for some people it's a lot harder. Like they really do not have your basic ability to calm themselves, to relax,
Hmm.
to like say, I'm going to stay on a task for, you know, some reasonable amount of time that's required to complete it, whether it's
Hmm.
10, 25, 50 minutes or an hour. And if you can identify that they actually is a problem, that they really can't manage themselves, then you're talking about an executive function skills issue where, maybe some type of therapeutic relationship is necessary. But,
Hmm.
but if you basically say to someone, well, you need to do this, and they're like, oh, it never occurred to me to do that. It didn't.
Hmm.
I'll mention one thing that a part of the things that I teach with the study skills is something, and a lot of this comes from a toolkit that I've been studying put by another provider. And there's something called the setup routine, where you're basically telling students, when you go home, you, just sit down for like 2 to 5 minutes, map out what homework needs to be done that night, how long you think it's going to take you to do it, and then take a break. And then just take a break. And again, I've just started doing this year, and my second student, super bright kid, very bright kid, but whatever, we can go into the details of what's going on. But we talked about this for over the course of a few weeks, and it was like game changing for me. It's just like it was so made such a difference for him. Just the whole idea that when he came home, he actually planned out what he had to do, but without the burden of actually doing it. Like he just said, this is what
Hmm.
I need to get done. It's going to take me about an hour and a half. Okay, I know what I need to do. I'm going to go have a snack now. I'm going to relax for a little bit because I just got home from school. And this is now another student may not have been able to do that, to run with it. But for this, again, this is not, he just needed like a plan. And I will say also, it helped that we were able to, over the course of a number of weeks, we were to talk about the implement. I don't think he did it the first week, as I recall. It wasn't the first week he immediately started doing this. But once he started doing it, he realized, oh, this actually makes my life easier. makes it a lot easier for
Hmm.
me to get my homework done. And, just, my afternoons and evenings are a little bit easier to deal with.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's such an important skill for people to learn. And I mean, in a way, planning is kind of a study skill, right? Because you're like, I'm studying for this much time, right? Let's talk about the other executive functioning skills. Yeah, I guess I feel like it's pretty obvious that like, everybody should kind of learn or teach their children how to do planning. I think that that's just a good idea. But let's talk about the other ones, right? It's like impulse control, like getting started on task, staying on task, and like other things like that, right? Like, how does that come into play and kind of how do you, I guess, just like train for those things?
Well, now, see, this is one thing about executive function skills. And again, I wouldn't call myself an expert in executive function skills, but a lot of times, I think there is this sense that I mean, for some people, there's no training of them. They're more like, this is kind of what you've got, in terms of, say,
Hmm.
and when we look at the base level, you're talking about things like working memory. Like, I'm not
Hmm.
sure that there's a consensus of people who believe you can fundamentally impact your working memory significantly. Like,
Hmm.
you've got a certain capacity for working memory. So you need to work within the constraints of your working memory, not like do some exercises or drill to increase your working memory.
Hmm.
And I think that again,
Yeah.
that's a very, where again, look, like, working memory is not a study skill, it's a capacity. But at the same time, it is considered a basic executive function skill. Like, you need to have a sense of, like, you know, what your working memory can handle.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think it's not just like what your working memory can handle. I think it's just even thinking about your working memory at all, at least for me, I feel like when I was a kid, I wasn't like strategizing around this. So, like, how do you've mentioned what your working memory can handle. I guess it's like, how do you train someone to understand what their working memory can handle? Because I actually don't know.
Well, it's interesting because, I've been working as a tutor for, 20 plus years. And it's only in the
Hmm.
past few years that I've been, particularly speaking in these terms. But for most of my time as a tutor, I've been telling kids, you've got to write things down or else you're going to forget where you are in the problem. Like,
Hmm.
that is basically, essentially, that's instruction on work within the constraints of your working memory. Like, you can't
Right.
remember all of an algebra of a complicated, challenging. You can't remember everything in an algebra problem at the
Yeah.
same time. You have to finish an intermediate step, write it down, and then move on to the next step. And essentially, what you're doing is it's like you're chunking. You're finishing one step, and then your result is one chunk that you can have in your working memory or on your sheet of paper, and then you open up space to do the next piece of the problem.
Yeah.
And I guess from my point of view, when I tell a kid to start writing things down more, I'm not trying to increase their working memory capacity. I'm trying to get them to work within the constraints of their working memory. And it's going to be different. It's clearly, you work with enough kids, you see it's very, very different. Like, how much different students can retain in their working memory, you know, at the same time. You know,
Hmm.
you know.
I mean, I think that is interesting, makes a lot of sense. I guess what I want to do now is like, I feel like we've kind of defined some examples of executive functioning.
Hmm.
Can we define what you would call study skills instead?
Yes. Oh,
Right? Like
absolutely.
let's talk about that. Because I feel like for me, I would say planning is, maybe both. Right? So I'm curious kind of,
Well,
yeah, what are like the key study skills that you think are, relevant to kind of this
Well,
conversation?
I'll
Yeah.
tell you, I have a little program I call Four Essential Study Skills, and these are what I
Hmm.
consider the key things that a student really needs to, or at least the place to start. And the first thing is just this kind of the science of learning, just understanding how your brain learns new information, in terms of encoding information like you read or you hear something, and the fact that you have to recall information. The whole idea that, like, and I think that hearing something and understanding something is not the same thing as retaining and mastering something. And so just getting them
Hmm.
to understand that, because I found a lot of students think once they understand it, they're done and they can leave it alone.
Hmm.
And then they're surprised when they can't use it, on a test or on a school test or a standardized test. So just understanding, what is necessary to learn something, retain it, the process of recall, repeated recall that is necessary to retain
Hmm.
information, just understanding that that is part of it. And also the fact that if you don't remember something the first time, that you should try to remember it a different way the next time. Like if you read it the first
Hmm.
time, maybe you should make a drawing the next time, or you should talk to a friend about it. Like you want to try
Hmm.
to keep learning things in new ways, basically across your senses. Like you want to use all your senses,
Hmm.
bring them all to bear to the learning task. So that's kind of number one. Next is note taking. And again, you kids vary very widely in terms of their ability to take notes and their consciousness of like what it means to take good notes and what you should do with your notes once you've taken them. So when I'm working with students,
Hmm.
we're talking about um, your first draft of your notes, and you first take your notes, whether it's from class or whether it's from reading something, a text, and then a process of kind of revising and editing um, your notes. Whereas
Hmm.
a lot of students, I think good, they're kids who already know this, who are good students. They go back to their notes, they reorganize their notes, they condense their notes, and they study their
Hmm.
notes when it comes to a test. But that whole process, and that's like about three important steps at a minimum of just getting your notes
Hmm.
down, taking your notes in class, then at a later date, a couple days later, revising your notes, condensing your notes, potentially, and then the third thing I was going to go to is something called it's just study tools, like taking your notes and turning them, putting them into a format that allows you to drill yourself, question yourself, prepare for test.
Hmm.
So those three things right there is the understanding the learning cycle, understanding how to take and use your notes in an effective manner, and then how to quiz yourself, how to create tools for yourself that allow you to make sure you've retained the information and can prepare for tests.
Yeah, I mean, all of that sounds to me like just like it's also a set of really important life skills that's going to teach you. Like, I think it's just gonna, if you actually had your child just doing the note, right? I feel like their ability, first off, their focus in class would probably increase a lot.
Yeah.
And second off, like, it would just help them kind of in the whole process, like downstream, right? Like any homework they have to do, etc. So when you've got somebody that's, you know, they might think they have an executive functioning problem or like they're not getting the grades that they want. Like I almost feel like I don't know, the study skills seem like the first thing I would try, but I'm curious what you think or how it if it depends, then like, who's each thing better for?
Well, I absolutely feel that the study skills is the first thing you should try because
Yeah.
you need them regardless. I think
Hmm.
I would only go to the level of the executive functions if for some reason it's hard for them to actually implement the study skills, because that's where I would think you've got an issue of the executive function skills if you're not actually able to implement the study skills. Because you could, again, as we said before, you could think of the study skills as being higher order executive function skills. Things like,
Hmm.
and even that example I used of note taking, where you actually have to go back, there's some planning involved. There's the taking of the notes. There's the planning when you're going to revise them. There's the creating of
Hmm.
the tools to help you recall the information. So there's a lot of organization. There's some planning. Um, and to the degree that there's difficulty in doing those things, then you might say, all right, well, maybe we need to look at, you know, something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess that is kind of leading into the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is, kind of parent intervention and kind of like where and when to use each thing.
Yeah.
Um, so, if you're talking to parents, how do you help them diagnose which of these things their child needs, or like, kind of just figuring out like the order of operations here.
Yeah. I mean, typically what I'm suggesting they do is, start working on just learning what these tasks are that need to be accomplished. And then I'm always on the lookout for what's getting in the way of them accomplishing it. And if I think there's something in the way of them accomplishing, I mean, I've had, students where I've spoken to parents and said, you know, they actually seem to have, one of the other, there's, again, in terms of basic executive function skills, working memory, like I said, I mentioned emotional regulation. There's also flexibility in thinking, like your ability to kind of shift between tasks mentally. Um, so for the most part, I'm expecting that the study skills are going to be effective on their own. And in the rare case, I'm saying, oh, you might want to have, you might want to get an actual, trained executive function coach to work with them on some of these lower level skills, or they might have some kind of, deficit.
Yeah, and I mean, that is kind of like at the heart of the question, right? Is it like, does your kid need help building habits and structure? Does it need help with just like tools? Like, here's like, your study program,
Right.
or, and sometimes it's probably both.
Well, I think that you mentioned the word habits, and I think that that's one thing about it takes a while to develop habits. So I think a lot of times people think
Hmm.
there's a bigger problem there is because they don't take into account the amount of time and effort it takes to develop good habits around studying. And
Hmm.
it's almost analogous to the whole thing I was talking about, the whole what it takes to learn something. Like students, parents, or students think they're having trouble learning things, but they don't take into account that they actually haven't done what's necessary for any normal human being to learn something. Like you don't have a problem,
Hmm.
you just haven't done what's necessary to accomplish that task yet. And it comes to the same thing with this with the other skills, where it will take a little while to develop the habit to do this on a regular basis. And again,
Hmm.
you know, there might be some conversation, like again, referencing the student I was mentioning before, one of the other things
Hmm.
we were working on was going to school on time. That was a whole nother issue,
Right.
which is obviously bigger than, study skills, but something he
Hmm.
needed to, get into the habit of doing.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, important. Like, I think executive functioning, it's this idea that it'll be this silver bullet, but at the end of the day, it's probably just blocking and tackling that your kid needs to be doing, right?
It's, I've heard people recently say there are a lot of people who are questioning whether how effective working on executive function skills are in isolation from an actual academic task, and these
Hmm.
other, supporting skills. Like, I think it's possible with, say, a neuropsych exam to identify, the state of a student's executive function skills. But in terms of working on like improving performance, just working on those skills alone, I'm not sure how effective that would be without also working on, you know, study skills, organizational skills, these other skills as well.
Yeah. Now that makes sense. Great. Well, yeah, then let's talk a little bit about just kind of what that looks like, right? I mean, let's like talk about kind of, if you're training someone for study skills, this is what you would do. If you're training someone for executive functioning skills, this is what you would do. So people can kind of determine what they think is more like appropriate.
Yeah, well, I would say that again, like I said, my focus is on the study skills. So when I say, hey, if you're training for study skills, the things I mentioned in terms of, just the science of learning, learning cycle, note taking, how to develop tools that will help you retain information. For longer term engagements with students, we do a lot that revolves around their habits, looking at what their habits are
Hmm.
like. You know, what are they doing week to week to support, um, getting the outcome that they want. So there's that is really and then there's also some things that are very specific to, getting ready for tests, things like that, because that comes up. But again, that's a lot of that is pulling all the other elements together. How good were your notes? Did you use your notes to create study tools? And then what are you doing week to week? Again, are you keeping up with your notes? Are you keeping up with your calendar? Have you created a calendar? And again, in a longer term engagement, very much about, are you actively engaged in the process of planning your work? And again, you can
Mhm.
tell, obviously, I think, we all know you can tell someone plan your work, but it's a whole nother thing for a team to, on a weekly basis, to remember to always, like, that's a typical intro at the beginning of a session is, let's run through all your courses, let's identify what your assignments are, and let's put them on your calendar, which,
Mhm.
you know, easy to say, but a little bit of work for a team to do for themselves on a regular basis every week.
Yeah, well, and I think that's also another question I had is like, so much of this seems to be focused around like building self-reliance in your child, right? But also like they're going to need help learning this stuff. So like where do you kind of draw the line both for yourself as kind of the coach or instructor, but also for the parents on like how much you should or should not be helping them with like either of these things really?
Well, I think it's like, immediately I think of the analogy of like the training wheels. When you're helping your child learn to ride the bike, when do you take the training wheels off, right? And you kind of feel like, well, the first time I take the training wheel off, they're probably going to fall and get hurt. But you may think it's time anyway. So I definitely feel like it's a very much of a judgment call of saying, because you're trying to create self-reliance, because you're learning these skills that are going to allow self-reliance. But when you're doing it initially, you're providing, a lot of support. Just as I
Mhm.
said, like, oh, we're going to take all your stuff off of from your assignments and we're going to put them on your calendar. Well, in the long run, that's something they need to do on their own. Maybe when they go to, whether it's high school on to college, although a lot of study skills coaches are working with college level students as well. So you could say whether it's a
Mhm.
underclassman versus an upperclassman. Certainly by the time you're an upperclassman, you would be thinking they would be taking their syllabus, planning their work, etc. At least that's certainly the goal. Um, so I definitely feel like it's a judgment call. You're always, or what I'm looking to do is support kids with the eye on, hey, I wanna like remove myself from the process as soon as it's appropriate, because this is all about them being self-directed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a
No, that
there's
makes a ton of sense.
there's a whole movement around self-directed learners, which I kind of feel like I don't know, identify with a little bit. I want to be part of what you want to be part of is helping them become self-directed learners. Like they can do it on their own, but they need to know what it is they're supposed to do first. And they generally need, some help, whether it's weeks or months, until it becomes habitual for them to do these things that support self-directed learning.
Right. Yeah, and I guess then in the pursuit of your child being a self-directed learner,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, like, what advice would you give to parents to kind of figure out the right way to approach that problem?
I think the advice I would give to a parent is to have them go through a cycle with support first. See if that,
Hmm.
and see how much of a difference that makes. Because I think you have to introduce them. I think, I do offer, like I mentioned, this 4 essential study skills, which is very informational. It's like you're going to learn over the course of these sessions all this great information about how to be a better learner. I don't actually have the expectation that most students will then just all of a sudden leave and be doing this, on their own. So, I mean, honestly, it's very similar to what I do with SAT prep again, which I've done for more than 20 years. It's like I can tell your
Hmm.
child very quickly what they need to do on the test, but it's only when we go through it together for a few, 2, 3 months that I expect that it'll start coming to them naturally. So I would say for a student trying to develop into a self-directed learner, into an independent studier, give them 2, 3 months of support just to make sure that they've had enough time to get familiar with all these different elements of what it means to be, an organized, a planner, sometimes it's not about do you have a planner? It's are you a planner? Like if you
Hmm.
are a planner, all you need is a napkin, right? You don't need
Hmm.
so give them some time to actually work with someone to develop methods. You know, how are we going to go about this? What are we going to do? How frequently are they going to do different tasks? What classes are they going to apply different tasks to? Like a lot of times I'm saying, well, we're going to use this on this particular class because it's more challenging. We don't need to do that on this other class because you've kind of got a handle on it. But I would say a couple months or a full semester just to see what kind of impact it would have. And then if they feel like they're good, then next semester or next year you're on your own, and hopefully retain it and keep working at that level.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Well, then I guess, if you were to conclude this here, and the title is Executive Functioning versus Study Skills, like what does your child need? I think that the answer is it depends,
It
right?
depends.
But I
Yes, it
think
does.
that I'd be curious kind of how you'd like to answer that question kind of in conclusion here as we wrap up.
I would say, in conclusion, I would say all kids need study skills. I would not suspect your child needs executive function skill support unless they're not able to master study skills on their own or with some, you know, elementary, rudimentary, basic support. Again, I think of, and this is a little bit my definition, but I think of executive function skills as being, it's almost therapeutic in the sense of, oh, we need to get very clear about what your child's capable of, working memory, emotional regulation, intellectual flexibility. Like, what are they actually capable of? It's almost like an analysis, an assignment. After all that's done, you still need to learn the study skills.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I think you probably would be better off learning both in most cases.
Well, yeah,
But it's just like the order and kind of what's like more pertinent right now.
yeah. And which do you need for individuals? So which do you need? Do you actually need support on the lower level executive function skills, or do you actually just need to know what the study skills are?
Hmm. Great. Yeah, anything we haven't covered today that you want to make sure we talk about before we wrap up?
No, that's pretty much it. I feel like, we've touched on a lot of points. And, like I said, I just feel like a lot of kids don't know about these things. They don't understand the basics of like what's necessary to get the result they want. And, if parents are willing to get someone in there to provide that basic support, it can make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Ed Antoine from Antoine Education. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT and CLT courses by going to achievable.me.